The golden light of the Astronomican flickered and died for 3 whole seconds. It happened on a Tuesday during the shift change of the High Scribes. Across the holy planet of Terra, 1 billion candles seemed to go dark at once. The great psychic beacon that guides human ships through the dangerous stars failed. In the high towers of the Imperial Palace, the alarm bells did not ring because the tech priests were too scared to touch them. They knew what the darkness meant. The Golden Throne was finally breaking. It had been rotting for 10,000 years, but this was different. This was not a slow decline. This was a sudden death. The machine that kept the master of mankind alive had suffered a catastrophic failure in its central power coil. Deep under the heavy rock of the Himalayas, a man named Magos Victorus stood over a table covered in forbidden blueprints. He was a high-ranking scientist of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but he did not act like one. He did not pray to the machines. He took them apart. He wore red robes that were stained with oil and preserving fluids. His metal hands clicked as he adjusted a brass lens over his left eye. He looked at the data slate on his desk. The numbers were flashing red. The life support systems were operating at 0% efficiency. The Emperor was not just sleeping anymore. He was fading into the dark. Victorus looked at the heavy door sealed with gold and ancient oaths. Behind that door sat the dying god. Victorus had a plan that the High Lords of Terra would call heresy. He did not want to repair the Golden Throne. He knew it could not be fixed. He wanted to bypass the chair entirely. He wanted to fix the body. He wanted to use raw electricity and forbidden genetics to force the dead cells to move again. He had spent 50 years gathering the parts. He had stolen gene seed from dead space marines. He had dug up ancient textbooks from the time before the Imperium. He had built a device in the shadows of the laboratory. It was a massive coil of copper and distinct alien bone. He called it the Prometheus engine. It hummed with a sound that made human teeth hurt. Victorus knew the custodian guards would cut him into pieces if they found out what he was doing. They were the golden giants who protected the Emperor. They viewed the Emperor's body as a holy relic that must never be touched. Victorus saw it differently. He saw the Emperor as a broken biological machine. Machines could be jump-started. He adjusted a heavy iron dial on his engine. Green sparks flew into the stale air. The smell of ozone and burning meat filled the cramped room. He whispered a prayer, but not to the machine god. He prayed to the logic of biology. He believed in muscle and nerve. He believed he could make the heart beat one more time. The ground shook beneath his feet. It was not an earthquake. It was the sound of panic starting in the hive cities above. The darkness of the Astronomican had lasted too long. The enemy fleets in the void would see the light go out. The sharks were coming. There was no more time for debate. There was no more time to ask for permission. Victorus grabbed the heavy activation lever. His metal fingers dug into the rubber handle. The coils screamed as they charged up. A bolt of raw white energy shot through the heavy cables. It bypassed the holy fuses and the safety breakers. It went straight into the conduit leading to the throne room. Victorus watched the power gauge spike to dangerous levels. He was not trying to heal a god. He was trying to shock a corpse back to life. The history of the galaxy held its breath. The silence broke with the sound of thunder inside the palace walls. The experiment had begun. The copper cables turned white from the heat. The energy from the Prometheus engine did not stop at the wall. It burned through the ancient stone and melted the gold purity seals. Magos Victorus watched the numbers on his screen climb higher and higher. He did not blink. His metal eyelids had been removed years ago to improve his focus. The room filled with thick black smoke as the insulation around the wires caught fire. Victorus did not grab a fire extinguisher. He knew that the fire meant the connection was solid. The electricity was flowing into the throne room. It was hitting the golden mechanics that kept the Emperor alive. Somewhere in the dark pipes, the current was jumping the gap. It was bypassing the broken fuses. It was forcing the ancient life support systems to spin faster than they had in 5,000 years. The floor shook violently. Tools rattled off the metal tables and clattered onto the iron grating. A glass jar filled with green preserving fluid fell and shattered. The preserved eye of an alien floated across the floor. Victorus ignored it. He was listening to the sound of the palace waking up. The alarm finally rang. It was a deep and mournful sound, like a giant bell tolling underwater. It meant that the sanctum had been breached. Victorus knew he had about 60 seconds before the doors were kicked in. He typed a final command into his console. He locked the voltage at maximum. He welded the control lever in place with a small laser torch. He wanted to make sure no one could turn it off. The experiment had to finish. The heavy blast doors to his laboratory exploded inward. There was no warning. 1 second the doors were there, and the next second they were shrapnel. A cloud of dust and pulverized rock filled the air. Through the dust came the golden giants. They moved faster than humans could track. They were the Adeptus Custodes. They were the Emperor's personal bodyguards. They were 10 feet tall and wore armor made of auramite. It was stronger than steel and shone like the sun. They carried spears with blades that crackled with blue energy. They did not shout. They did not ask for surrender. They simply killed. The combat servitors that guarded Victorus stood no chance. The half-robot soldiers raised their heavy guns, but they were too slow. The Custodes cut them in half before the triggers were pulled. Oil and blood sprayed across the walls. A severed robotic head rolled to Victorus's feet. He did not look down. He raised his hands in the air, but he kept his metal fingers near the main power coupling. The leader of the Golden Giants stepped forward. His name was Shield Captain Valerian. His helmet faceplate was a snarling lion. He pointed his guardian spear at Victorus's chest. The tip of the blade was inches from the Magos's robes. The energy from the blade made Victorus's skin tingle. Valerian spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding stones. He demanded to know what Victorus had done. He accused him of high treason. He said that Victorus had attacked the Holy Throne. Victorus did not beg for his life. He pointed to the screen. He told the giant to look at the data. He explained that the throne had failed. The light had gone out. The Emperor was dead for 3 seconds. Victorus said he was the only one who had acted. He explained that he was jump-starting the heart of the master of mankind. Valerian hesitated. Custodes were trained to kill threats instantly, but they were also trained to protect the Emperor's life above all else. If the Magos was telling the truth, then killing him might stop the process. Valerian looked at the screen. The lines were jagged and chaotic. They showed a massive surge of power hitting the Golden Throne. Valerian ordered his men to hold fire. He grabbed Victorus by the throat and lifted him off the ground. The Magos dangled in the air. His metal legs kicked helplessly. Valerian marched him out of the ruined lab and into the hallway. They moved fast. The corridors of the Imperial dungeon were vast and dark. They were lined with statues of dead heroes and banners that had turned to dust. Thousands of scribes and tech priests were running in panic. They dropped their scrolls and data slates. They fell to their knees as the Custodes passed. They thought it was the end of the world. The ground continued to shake. It was a rhythmic shaking now. Thump, thump, thump. It felt like a heartbeat, but it was too loud. It was shaking the dust from the ceiling miles above. Deep inside the walls, the pipes were groaning. The pressure of the steam and the coolants was rising. Victorous wheezed as the giant's hand squeezed his neck. He tried to speak. He said that the shaking was a good sign. It meant the muscles were contracting. Valerian did not answer. He dragged Victorous toward the Eternity Gate. This was the massive door that led to the throne room. It was guarded by 2 warhound titans. These were giant robot walkers with guns the size of tanks. The titans were agitated. Their war horns blared in the confined space. The sound was deafening. The titan pilots were confused by the power surge. Their sensors were blinded. Valerian shouted an override code. The titans froze. The Custodes dragged Victorous through the smaller access doors at the base of the gate. They entered the Sanctum Imperialis. The air here was hot and dry. It smelled of old incense and rotting meat. The psychic pressure was immense. It felt like a heavy weight pressing on the brain. Normal humans would go mad in minutes. Victorous was not a normal human. His brain was half computer. He focused on his logic circuits to keep from screaming. The room was vast. It was like a cavern made of gold and machinery. Cables as thick as tree trunks hung from the ceiling. Steps led up a mountain of machinery to the golden throne. And there sat the Emperor. He was a skeleton. His skin was tight and grey. He was wrapped in wires and tubes. For 10,000 years he had not moved. But now the wires were glowing white hot. The electricity from Victorious's machine was coursing through them. Arcs of lightning jumped from the machinery to the floor. The lightning struck the stone and left black scorch marks. The Custodes who stood guard around the throne were holding their ground. They did not flinch as the sparks hit their armor, but they looked tense. They had never seen the throne act like this. Valerian threw Victorous onto the floor at the base of the stairs. He ordered the Magos to stop it. He said the energy was damaging the holy relic. Victorous looked up. He adjusted his ocular lens. He saw something that made his logic core freeze. The Emperor's chest was moving. It was a small movement. It was jerky and unnatural. It looked like a puppet being pulled by a string. The rib cage expanded and then collapsed with a wet cracking sound. Dust flew off the ancient armor. The Emperor was breathing. It was not a gentle breath. It was a violent spasm. The machinery of the throne screamed in protest. The golden plates on the side of the chair buckled. A pipe burst and sprayed superheated steam into the air. One of the Custodes on the steps was hit by the steam. He did not scream, but he fell to one knee. His armor turned red from the heat. Valerian raised his spear to strike Victorous down. He thought the Magos was destroying the Emperor. He thought the spasms were the body breaking apart. But then a sound cut through the noise. It was not a machine sound. It was a voice. It was a dry and rasping sound like dead leaves dragging on stone. The sound came from the throne. The Emperor gasped. The psychic shockwave hit the room instantly. It was invisible, but it hit with the force of a bomb. Every glass surface in the room shattered. The remaining candles were blown out. Victorous was thrown backward across the floor. He slid until he hit a pillar. His sensors warned him of internal damage. He looked up. The light of the Astronomican came back. It did not flicker on slowly. It slammed into existence. The light was so bright it shone through the walls. It was blinding. But it was not the steady golden light of the past. It was white and jagged. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the heartbeat. Thump, flash, thump, flash. High above in the orbital stations, the navigators screamed. The light burned their third eyes. It was too strong. It was uncontrolled. Back in the throne room, the silence returned for a moment. The machinery hummed loudly. The Emperor's head had moved. It was tilted slightly to the left. The empty sockets of his eyes were looking down at the Custodes. Valerian dropped his spear. He fell to his knees. The other Custodes did the same. They thought it was a miracle. They thought their god had returned. Victorus did not kneel. He stood up shakily. He looked at the readouts on his wrist computer. He saw the truth. The brain activity was strange. It was not the pattern of a conscious human. It was the pattern of a chaotic storm. The logic centers of the Emperor's brain were firing randomly. The memory centers were burning out. The aggression centers were spiked to maximum. This was not a resurrection of the soul. It was a jumpstart of the biological weapon. The Emperor's hand twitched. The clawed gauntlet scraped against the gold armrest of the chair. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard. The finger pointed. It did not point at an enemy. It pointed at the custodian nearest to him. A bolt of psychic lightning shot from the Emperor's finger. It hit the custodian in the chest. The gold armor shattered. The giant super soldier was thrown into the air. He hit the wall and slid down. He was dead. Smoke rose from the hole in his chest. Valerian stood up. He was confused. He shouted to his lord. He asked for orders. The Emperor did not speak again. The body convulsed. The head snapped back. The mouth opened in a silent scream. More lightning arced from the body. It struck the machinery blindly. It was destroying the life support that kept it alive. Victorus realized the error. The Prometheus engine had provided the power, but it had provided too much. The body had no regulator. The mind was not driving the body. The raw power of the warp was driving it. The Emperor was currently a conduit for infinite energy with no control valve. Victorus ran toward the stairs. Valerian blocked his path. The Captain General demanded to know what was happening. Victorus shouted that they had to ground the connection. They had to give the energy somewhere to go, or the Emperor would explode. He explained that the body could not hold this much power without the mind to control it. The mind was still fragmented. It was lost in the warp. Only the body was here. And the body was reacting like a frightened animal. Valerian looked at his dead comrade. He looked at the shaking form of his master. He made a choice. He grabbed Victorus and threw him toward the controls at the base of the throne. He told the Magos to fix it. He said, if the Emperor died, Victorus would die 1,000 times. Victorus scrambled to the control panel. It was an ancient interface. The runes were old and complex. He plugged his data spike into the socket. He tried to dampen the flow from his engine. The controls were locked. The surge had fused the circuit. He could not turn it down. He could only redirect it. He looked at the schematics of the palace. He needed a sink for the energy. He needed something massive to absorb the excess power. He saw the readout for the darker cells, the prison blocks, the null chambers where they kept the enemies of the Imperium. There was a massive psychic dampening field there. It was used to hold dangerous sorcerers. If he shunted the power there, it might burn out the prisoners, but it would save the throne. Victorus typed the command. He rerouted the overflow. The lightning around the Emperor stopped arcing wildly. It flowed into the floor cables. The Emperor's body slumped back against the chair. The breathing slowed down. It was still ragged and wet, but it was steady. The immediate danger of explosion was gone, but the cost was instant. Deep in the prison levels, 1,000 screams rang out at once. The surge hit the cells. The psychic prisoners were fried instantly. Their brains boiled. But the dampening field absorbed the energy. The palace stopped shaking. Valerian walked up the stairs slowly. He approached the throne. He knelt beside the dead custodian. He checked for life signs. There were none. The Emperor had killed one of his own. Valerian looked at the Emperor. The skeletal face was still, but the chest continued to rise and fall. The heart was beating on its own. The machine was helping, but the biological rhythm had returned. The Emperor was alive in the biological sense, but was he sane? Valerian looked down at Victorus. Demagos was checking his data slate. Victorus looked pale. He said the procedure was a partial success. The autonomic functions were restored. The cellular decay had halted, but there was no response from the higher brain functions. The Emperor was in a state of waking coma. He was a sleeping giant who could lash out with lightning if disturbed. Valerian looked at the doors of the sanctum. He heard heavy boots approaching. The High Lords of Terra were coming. They would demand answers. They would see the dead guard. They would see the forbidden tech. Valerian knew that politics would destroy everything if he was not careful. He made a decision. He signaled his men to form a wall around the throne. He told Victorus to hide the data slate. He said that no one was to know the Emperor had attacked his own guard. They would say the guard died defending the Emperor from a warp feedback. They would lie to save the dream. The great doors opened. A procession of terrified officials entered. At the front was High Lord Hematalos. He was a small man in heavy robes. He looked at the destruction. He looked at the smoke. He saw the Emperor's chest moving. His eyes went wide. He fell to his knees and wept. He shouted that the Emperor was waking. He shouted that the Golden Age had returned. He did not see the danger. He only saw the miracle. Victorus watched from the shadows of the machinery. He knew the truth. He had created a monster, a god monster that had infinite power and the instincts of a cornered beast. He saw the Emperor's hand twitch again. The fingers curled into a fist. The gold armrest bent under the pressure. The metal groaned. Victorus knew this was just the beginning. The body was getting stronger every minute. The muscles were regenerating. The dry skin was filling with fluid, but the eyes remained empty. There was no light of wisdom in them. Only the cold light of the Astronomican reflecting off dead orbits. The High Lords began to chant a prayer. They were celebrating their own doom. Valerian stood like a statue. He kept his hand near his weapon. He was not guarding the Emperor from the galaxy anymore. He was guarding the galaxy from the Emperor. The silence of the tomb was gone. The heavy breathing of the master of mankind filled the room. It sounded like a bellows fanning a fire, and the fire was going to consume them all. Victorus saw a light blinking on a side console. It was a Vox channel from the outside, a report from the fleet. The Astronomican was back, but it was shifting. The ships in the warp were reporting strange currents. The beacon was not guiding them home. It was guiding them somewhere else. The mind of the Emperor was projecting a new destination. Victorus traced the coordinates. His heart sank. The beacon was focusing on the edge of the galaxy. It was pointing into the deep dark. It was calling out to something, or perhaps it was warning something to stay away. The strategic consequences were already starting. The signal was strong enough to be seen by every enemy faction in the galaxy. The great rift flared. The Chaos Gods would feel this. The hive minds would feel this. The Necrons in their tombs would feel this. Victorus realized he had rung a dinner bell for the entire universe. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He had wanted to save the Imperium. He might have just accelerated its end. The Emperor took another deep breath. The sound echoed like a storm wind. The act of breathing was becoming easier for him. The ancient lungs were clearing. The impossible was happening. But nobody was smiling, except the fools. The wise men in the room were terrified. The script of history had been burned. A new page was being written in blood. The bells of terror rang for 7 days and 7 nights without stopping. The sound was not joyous. It was a heavy industrial clang that shook the dust from the hive cities. The message went out through the astropathic choir. It was a simple message of 3 words. The king wakes. This message traveled faster than light. It reached the fortress worlds of Cudia's remnants. It reached the farming worlds of Ultramar. It reached the hidden monasteries of the Inquisition. The reaction was instant hysteria. On 1,000 worlds, the factories stopped working because the workers fell to their knees to pray. The production of ammunition halted. The loading of grain ships ceased. The administrative machine of the Imperium, which relied on fear and routine, suddenly broke under the weight of hope. But inside the Imperial Palace, there was no hope. There was only panic. The Sanctum Imperialis had become a medical ward. Magos Victorus had not slept in 4 days. He stood on a floating platform next to the Golden Throne. He was overseeing the installation of new feeding tubes. The Emperor's body was demanding fuel. The electricity from the Prometheus engine had started the engine, but the biological furnace needed meat to burn. The skeletal frame was growing. It was a terrifying process to watch. Muscles were knitting together over exposed bone. They looked like raw red ropes coiling under the grey skin. The skin itself was thickening. It turned from the colour of parchment to the colour of bruised iron. The Emperor was not healing into a beautiful man. He was healing into a warlord of the barbaric past. His jaw had reset with a loud crack that echoed through the room. His teeth were growing back sharp and white. He looked dangerous. He looked like a predator that had been starved for 10 millennia. Victorus watched the nutrient paste flow through the clear tubes. It was a thick slurry made from processed proteins and high-grade chemicals. The Emperor's body consumed it at an impossible rate. The stomach was working violently. The metabolism was running hot. The heat coming off the body was enough to blister paint 10 feet away. The Custodes had to step back. The air shimmered with thermal waves. Shield Captain Valerian stood at the foot of the stairs. He held his spear tight. He did not like what he saw. He saw a creature that was eating resources and growing stronger, but showed no sign of humanity. The eyes were still open. They were still empty. They tracked movement like a turret gun tracks a target. When a servo skull floated too close, the Emperor's head snapped toward it instantly. The movement was a blur. It was pure reflex. There was no recognition. There was only threat assessment. High Lord Hematalos entered the room with a cadre of priests. He was the master of the administratum. He was the man who counted the coins and the bullets of the Imperium. He looked tired. He held a data slate that was scrolling with disaster reports. He walked up to Valerian. He did not look at the Emperor. He was too afraid. He spoke to the custodian in a low voice. He said the food shipments to the hive city of Trazyn had been diverted to the palace. He said the people were starving. He said the riots had started in the lower levels. The people wanted to see their god. They were crushing each other at the gates. Millions of pilgrims were pressing against the outer walls of the palace. They could feel the psychic pulse of the waking emperor. It was calling to them. It was a siren song. It made them weep and claw at the stone. Hematalos said they needed a sign. He wanted to open the gates. He wanted to show the emperor to the people to calm them down. Valerian looked at the twitching giant on the throne. He looked at the tubes pumping sludge into the royal throat. He refused. He said the emperor was not ready. He said the emperor was dangerous. Hematalos argued. He said the faith of the people was the only thing holding the planet together. If they did not see a miracle, they would burn the city down. Valerian grabbed the High Lord by the collar of his expensive robes. He dragged him closer to the throne. He forced him to look. The emperor was convulsing again. A spasm of growth was hitting his right arm. The bicep swelled. The skin split and healed in seconds. A wave of psychic force rolled off the body. It hit Hematalos like a physical punch. The High Lord's nose started to bleed. He fell back. He gasped for air. Valerian told him that this was no miracle. This was a biological detonation. If they opened the gates, the Emperor would not bless the crowd. He might kill them all with a thought. Himatalos fled the room. He ran back to his safety bunkers. But he did not stop the rumors. The ecclesiarchy was already broadcasting sermons. They said the Emperor was rising to lead a new great crusade. They promised salvation. They were writing checks that the Emperor's broken mind could not cash. Deep in the void of space, the second catastrophe began. The Astronomican was the lighthouse of the Imperium. For 10,000 years, it had been a steady beam of golden light, generated by the sacrifice of psychers and focused by the Emperor's mind. It guided the ships through the hell of the warp. But now, the focus was gone. The mind was fractured. The beam was thrashing. It was no longer a beam. It was a strobe light. It pulsed with the erratic heartbeat of the resurrected body. In the segmentum solar, a massive fleet was in transit. It was Battle Fleet Agamemnon. They were returning from a war against the Orcs. They were carrying 3 million soldiers and 500 tanks. They were in the deep war when the light changed. The navigator on the flagship was an old woman named Cassia. She sat in her blister dome looking into the swirling madness of the Imperium. She looked for the golden light. Suddenly, the light flared white hot. It was blinding. It burned out her retinas instantly. She screamed as her brain was overloaded with raw psychic power. She lost the path. The ship was thrown off course. It slammed into a reef of warp energy. The Geller fields that protected the ship from demons flickered and died. The reality of the ship dissolved. The 3 million soldiers did not die instantly. That would have been a mercy. They were exposed to the raw stuff of chaos. The ship merged with the warp. It became a twisted wreck of metal and flesh. This scene was repeated across the galaxy. Thousands of ships were lost in a single hour. Trade routes that had existed for centuries were erased. The Imperium's supply lines were cut. Food ships did not arrive. Ammo ships vanished. The blood of the Empire stopped flowing. Back in the throne room, Victorus saw the energy spike on his sensors. He saw the Astronomican flaring. He knew what was happening. The Emperor was projecting his internal chaos into the galaxy. Victorus tried to dampen the signal. He typed commands into the Prometheus engine. He tried to reduce the voltage. The machine did not respond. The Emperor's body was drawing the power on its own now. It was pulling energy from the Earth itself. The geothermal taps deep under the Himalayas were draining. The lights in the palace dimmed as the Emperor fed. He was becoming a black hole for energy. Victorus realized the biology was adapting too fast. The cells were not just regenerating, they were evolving. The Emperor was becoming a superconductor for the warp. The separation between the material world and the immaterial world was thinning inside the room. Shadows on the wall began to move on their own. Whispers echoed from the corners of the room where no one was standing. The Custodes tightened their formation. They activated the disruption fields on their blades. They knew the enemy was close. The enemy was not physical, it was spiritual. The barrier was breaking. The first breach happened at the Lionsgate spaceport. It was the main landing zone for the palace. It was crowded with millions of desperate refugees trying to get off the planet and millions of pilgrims trying to get in. The psychic scream of the Emperor hit the crowd. It was not a sound. It was a wave of pure emotion. It was 10,000 years of pain and frustration released at once. The weak minds of the civilians could not handle it. Their eyes rolled back in their heads. They began to foam at the mouth. A riot broke out instantly. But it was not a normal riot. It was a madness. People attacked each other with their bare hands. They tore at their own faces. And then the fabric of reality tore. In the center of the crowd, a portal opened. It was a jagged tear in the air. Pink and blue fire spilled out. Horrors of change poured through the gap. They were demons of change. They were attracted to the massive shift in destiny caused by the resurrection. They giggled and screamed as they threw fire at the mob. The local Arbites fired their shotguns, but the bullets passed through the demons like smoke. The demons did not want to conquer the spaceport. They wanted to reach the source of the change. They wanted the Emperor. The alarm reached the throne room. Valerian listened to the report. Demons on Terra. It was the nightmare scenario. If the demons reached the throne while the Emperor was vulnerable, all would be lost. Valerian looked at his small force. He could not leave the Emperor unguarded. He had to trust the outer defenses. But the outer defenses were paralyzed by the psychic wave. The soldiers were vomiting and shaking. They could not aim their weapons. The Emperor's presence was incapacitating his own army. Valerian realized the terrible truth. The Emperor was too strong for valid reality. His mere existence was suppressing the human mind. He was like a sun burning the ants that crawled on him. Valerian turned to Victorus. He ordered the Magos to sedate the Emperor. He said they had to put him back to sleep. Victorus shook his head. He said it was impossible. The metabolism was running like a runaway train. If they tried to stop it now, the biological shock would destroy the planet. The energy buildup would result in a psychic nuclear explosion. They had to ride it out. They had to let the seizure finish. The Emperor suddenly sat up straight. The movement was violent. The feeding tubes ripped out of his neck. Fluid sprayed across the gold floor. He made a sound. It was a deep, guttural roar. He tried to stand. The metal of the throne groaned. The ancient clamps held his legs. He fought against them. He was fighting his own life support. The Custodes raised their spears. They were unsure. Should they attack the Emperor to keep him in the chair? It went against every layer of their indoctrination. But if he broke free, he would disconnect the final cables that tethered his soul to the beacon. He would be lost in the warp forever. Valerian shouted a command. He ordered his men to hold him down. It was the ultimate blasphemy. The golden giants charged up the stairs. They threw their weight against the Emperor's chest. They tried to pin him to the chair. The Emperor lashed out. His hand struck a custodian. The blow crumpled the auramite breastplate like paper. The custodian was thrown across the room and died instantly. The Emperor was strong, impossibly strong. He was fueled by the souls of the faithful. Victorus saw the data on the screen. The Emperor was draining the life force of the immediate area. The Custodes who were wrestling him started to age. Their armor lost its shine. Their movements slowed down. The Emperor was eating their vitality to fuel his struggle. He was a vampire god. Valerian felt his strength fading. He felt his knees go weak. He looked into the Emperor's face. The eyes were still empty, but the mouth was snarling. The Emperor was operating on pure survival instinct. He felt the pain of the resurrection, and he wanted it to stop. He wanted to destroy the source of the pain. The source was the machine. The Emperor reached for the Prometheus engine. He wanted to crush it. Victorus saw the danger. If the engine was destroyed, the feedback loop would kill them all. Victorus ran to the emergency cutoff. He had to sever the connection manually. He had to switch the power back to the failing Golden Throne systems. It was a downgrade, but it was safe. He grabbed the heavy iron lever. It was hot. It burned his metal hand. He pulled it down with all his weight. The connection to the Prometheus engine was cut. The white lightning stopped. The room plunged into the dim red light of the emergency backups. The sudden loss of power hit the Emperor like a hammer. He collapsed back into the chair. His thrashing stopped. He lay there panting. His breath was ragged. The drain on the Custodes stopped. Valerian fell to his knees. He gasped for air. He felt 10 years older. He looked at his hands. The skin was wrinkled. He looked at the Emperor. The body was still alive. The muscles were still there. The resurrection had not been reversed, but the acceleration had stopped. The Emperor was now in a stable state of semi-life. He was a hulking brute of a man trapped in a broken chair. The immediate crisis of the explosion was over, but the damage was done. Outside the palace, the demons faded away as the psychic storm settled. The breach closed, but the dead remained. 10,000 pilgrims lay dead at the Lion's Gate. Their souls had been sucked dry by the event. They looked like husks. The High Lords received the reports. They were silent. They realized the cost of the miracle. The Emperor was back, but he was not a savior. He was a resource hog. He was a danger to his own people, and he was hungry. The silence in the throne room was heavy. Victorous walked slowly to the base of the throne. He checked the readouts. The Emperor's brain activity had changed. The chaotic storm had settled into a pattern. It was a rhythmic pulse. It was a signal. It was not a speech. It was a demand. The Emperor's mind was broadcasting a single concept. It was an image repeated over and over. It was an image of a key. Victorous looked at Valerian. Valerian stood up shakily. He asked what the Emperor wanted. Victorous pointed to the screen. He decoded the psychic image. The Emperor wanted access to the dark cells. He wanted the forbidden vaults beneath the palace. He wanted something that was locked away in the deepest dark. Valerian went cold. He knew what was in the dark cells, things that could destroy reality, things the Emperor had sealed away during the Great Crusade. If the waking monster wanted to open those doors, it meant one of two things. Either he needed a weapon, or he remembered something that the rest of history had forgotten. The doors to the sanctum opened again. This time it was not a High Lord. It was a messenger from the astropathic choir. The messenger was blind and bleeding from the eyes. He carried a sealed scroll. He collapsed at Valerian's feet. Valerian took the scroll. He broke the seal. He read the message. It was from the Ultima Segmentum. It was from Roboute Guilliman. The Primarch had felt the disturbance. The son had felt the father wake up, and the son was coming. He was bringing the Indomitus Crusade fleet. He was bringing 1,000 ships. He demanded that the High Lords explain why the Astronomican had tried to kill his fleet. He demanded to know who had touched the throne. Valerian looked at Victorous. The time for secrets was over. The avenging son was returning to Terra, and he would not be happy to find his father turned into a science experiment. Valerian looked at the Emperor. The Emperor's head turned slowly. He looked at the scroll in Valerian's hand. For a second, just a split second, Valerian thought he saw a spark of intelligence in the dead eyes. It was not kindness. It was recognition. The Emperor knew his son was coming, and the Emperor's hand twitched toward his sword, the sword that burned with fire, the sword that was the symbol of his authority. The Emperor wanted his weapon. Victorous stepped back. He realized the terrifying possibility. The Emperor did not view Guilliman as a son. In his broken mental state, he viewed another genetic demigod as a rival. The resurrection had brought back the warlord, but it had left the father behind. Civil war was not just a possibility. It was sitting in the chair. The silence in the Imperial Palace did not last long. It was broken by the sound of boots. Thousands of boots. They were not the heavy metal boots of Space Marines. They were the leather boots of the Inquisition. Inquisitor Lord Karamazov sat on his walking throne of judgment. He was a man who burned innocent people just to be sure he caught the guilty ones. He was outside the Eternity Gate. He had brought his personal army of stormtroopers. They wore black carapace armor and carried hell guns. They looked like statues made of obsidian. Karamazov demanded entry. He shouted into the Voxcaster. He said he could smell the witchcraft. He said the Emperor's soul was being tampered with. The Custodes at the gate did not move. They stood with their spears crossed. They told the Inquisitor that the sanctum was closed by the order of the Captain General. Karamazov did not care about orders. He cared about purity. He ordered his multi-melter servitors to target the gate. It was a standoff. The Inquisition was threatening to shoot the Emperor's bodyguards to save the Emperor's soul. Inside the throne room, Valerian watched the security feed. He saw the tension rising. He knew Karamazov was a fanatic. If the Inquisitor fired the first shot, it would start a war between the Holy Orders of Terra. Valerian looked at Victorus. The Magos was working frantically on the floor plates. He was rerouting power cables. Victorus said they had a new problem. The problem was hunger. The Emperor was consuming the psychic sacrifices too fast. Before the resurrection, the Golden Throne required 1,000 psychers every day. These were people with psychic powers who were fed into the machine to keep the Astronomican burning. Now the Emperor was awake. His metabolism was active. His soul was grabbing the energy and eating it raw. Victorus showed Valerian the numbers. The Emperor had consumed 1,000 souls in the last hour. The holding cells were emptying. The black ships that brought the psychers to Terra were not arriving fast enough. If the fuel ran out, the Emperor would turn on the nearest source of power. He would eat the minds of everyone in the palace. Valerian felt a cold sweat on his neck. He had to find more fuel. He opened a channel to the High Lords. He told them to empty the prisons. He told them to round up every unsanctioned psyker in the hive cities. He told them to send the astropaths. The astropaths were the galactic communicators. They were vital to the Imperium. But Valerian did not care. He needed coal for the fire. The High Lords protested. They said the Imperium would go blind if they sacrificed the communicators. Valerian said the Imperium would go dead if they did not. The order went out. The streets of Terra became a hunting ground. The Arbites kicked down doors. They dragged screaming mystics and fortune-tellers into the backs of armored trucks. They drove them to the Eternity Gate. The people watched in horror. They thought the Emperor was a benevolent god. They did not know he was a starving furnace. The trucks bypassed Karamazov's blockade. The Inquisitor watched them go in. He saw the fear in the eyes of the prisoners. He realized something was wrong. The demand for souls was too high. He lowered his weapons. He decided to wait. He wanted to see what would happen when the fuel ran out. Inside the sanctum, the fresh batch of psychers was hooked into the coffins. The machinery hummed. The life force was drained instantly. The Emperor took a deep breath. His skin flushed with color. He looked stronger. He sat up straighter. The muscles in his neck bulged. He looked at the great sword resting against the side of the dais. His hand twitched towards it again. He wanted his weapon. High above the planet, the void tore open. It was not a small tear. It was a massive wound in reality. The Macrag's Honor emerged from the warp. It was 26 kilometers long. It was the flagship of the Ultramarines. It was followed by a fleet that filled the sky. There were battle barges, strike cruisers, and mass conveyors. Roboute Guilliman had arrived. The Primarch stood on the bridge of his ship. He looked at the hololith of Terra. He saw the energy readings. He saw the chaotic strobe of the Astronomican. He saw the fleet of the Solar Watch in defensive formation. He opened a channel to the planet. He did not ask for permission to land. He announced his arrival. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a thunderhead. He demanded a sitrep from the Captain General. Valerian answered from the throne room. He told Guilliman that the Emperor was alive. He told him that Magos had succeeded. There was a long silence on the Vox. Guilliman did not cheer. He was a student of history. He knew that dead things should stay dead. He asked about his father's mind. Valerian hesitated. He said the mind was recovering. It was a lie. Guilliman detected the hesitation. He ordered his fleet to hold position. He boarded a Thunderhawk gunship. He took his honor guard. He was coming down to see for himself. The atmospheric entry was rough. The psychic storm around the palace was messing with the flight computers. The pilot had to fly manually. The Thunderhawk shook violently. Guilliman sat strapped in his seat. He wore the armor of fate. He held the Emperor's sword, the sword he had been carrying since his own resurrection. He looked at the blade. It was flaming. The fire on the sword was reacting to the proximity of its true master. It was burning hotter than usual. It was trying to leap from his hand. Guilliman gripped the hilt tighter. He felt a sense of dread. He landed at the Lion's Gate spaceport. The ramp dropped. He walked out into the ash and the wind. The Custodes were waiting for him. They bowed. They did not block his path. No one blocked a Primarch. Guilliman walked past the ruins of the riot. He saw the blood on the ground. He saw the damage to the walls. He walked through the long corridors of the palace. He saw the fear in the faces of the bureaucrats. They looked at him like he was an executioner. He reached the Eternity Gate. Karamazov was still there. The Inquisitor bowed low. He told Guilliman that there was heresy inside. He told him that a tech priest had defiled the throne. Guilliman nodded. He said he would deal with it. He walked through the gate. The Titans saluted him with their war horns. The sound was mournful. Guilliman entered the throne room. The heat hit him first. It was a dry oven heat. Then the smell. It smelled of ozone and burning copper and old blood. He walked up the long processional way. He saw the mountain of machinery. He saw the golden figure at the top. He stopped. He looked at his father. He remembered the Emperor as a being of golden light and perfect logic. He remembered a man who spoke of science and reason. He did not recognize the thing in the chair. The Emperor was huge. His armor was cracked and stretched by his new muscles. His hair was long and grey and wild. His face was a mask of raw power. There was no kindness in it. There was no recognition. The Emperor was looking at the ceiling. He was watching the energy arcs. Guilliman walked up the stairs. The Custodes stepped back. Valerian stood his ground for a moment and then stepped aside. Victorus was hiding behind a console. He was terrified of the Primarch. Guilliman stood 10 feet from the throne. He looked into the empty eye sockets. He whispered the word father. The Emperor's head snapped down. The movement was instant. The empty eyes locked onto Guilliman. The Emperor made a sound. It was a growl. It was deep and vibrating. It shook the floor plates. The Emperor raised his hand. He pointed at the sword on Guilliman's hip. He wanted it back. Guilliman felt a psychic command slam into his brain. It was not a request. It was a seizure. Give. The word echoed in his skull. It hurt. Guilliman stumbled back. He put his hand on the hilt of the sword. The Emperor roared. It was a sound of pure rage. Psychic lightning shot from the Emperor's hand. It hit Guilliman in the chest. The Primarch was thrown backward. He tumbled down the stairs. He hit the bottom with a crash of ceramite. The Custodes drew their weapons. They were confused. Their master had just attacked his son. Guilliman stood up. His armor was scorched. He was not injured, but he was shaken. He looked up at the dais. The Emperor was trying to stand up again. The clamps were groaning. The feeding tubes were pulling tight. The Emperor was snarling like a trapped animal. Guilliman realized the truth. The man on the throne was gone. Only the power remained, and the power was angry. Guilliman shouted to Victorus. He demanded to know what they had done. Victorus stammered. He said he had fixed the body. Guilliman shouted that they had broken the seal. They had let the warp into the meat. He said this was not the Emperor. This was a warp entity wearing his father's skin. Valerian stepped forward. He argued. He said the Emperor had saved them. He said the Emperor had destroyed the demons at the gate. Guilliman countered. He said a wild dog will bite a wolf, but it will also bite its master. He pointed at the throne. He said, look at him. He is not ruling. He is feeding. The Emperor roared again. The psychic pressure increased. The glass on the sensors cracked. The air became heavy. Gravity seemed to increase. Everyone fell to their knees except Guilliman. He used his servo motors to stay standing. He looked at the Emperor. He refused to give up the sword. He knew that if that creature got the sword, it would cut the planet in half. The strategic situation shifted instantly. Guilliman tapped his Vox bead. He ordered his honor guard to secure the room. He ordered the fleet to target the palace shields. He was preparing for a hostile takeover of the throne room. Valerian heard the order. He raised his spear. He told Guilliman to stand down. He said the Custodes would not allow the Primarch to threaten the Emperor. It was a standoff. The Ultramarines against the Custodes, the Sons against the Guardians. And in the middle was the monster. The Emperor watched them. He seemed to understand the conflict. He seemed to enjoy it. The chaos fed him. The emotion fed him. The anger between Valerian and Guilliman was like sweet nectar to the psychic vampire on the chair. The Emperor laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. He lifted his hand again. This time, he did not point at Guilliman. He pointed at the machinery of the throne. He pointed at the delicate regulators that Victorus had installed. He clenched his fist. The regulators crushed themselves. Metal twisted into scrap. Sparks showered down. The dampeners were gone. The Emperor was now fully connected to the grid without a filter. The power surge was immediate. The lights in the palace exploded. The darkness was total except for the white glow of the Emperor's body. He was glowing with internal fire. The heat became unbearable. The gold on the throne started to melt. It dripped down the stairs like yellow wax. The Emperor stood up. The clamps on his legs snapped. The metal gave way. He stood to his full height. He was 14 feet tall. He was a giant of muscle and rage. He ripped the last of the tubes from his body. He stood on the top of the pyramid. He looked down at the tiny figures below. He raised his arms. A wave of force knocked everyone flat. Guilliman was pinned to the floor. Valerian was pinned. Victorus was crushed against his console. The Emperor took a step forward. He was leaving the throne. He was descending. The Astronomican flickered wildly. Ships in orbit lost power. The planetary shields failed. The Emperor was walking towards his son. He wanted the sword, and he was going to take it. Outside the palace, the news spread. The shields were down. The darkness had fallen. The people screamed. They thought the Emperor had died. In reality, he was just getting started. On Mars, the Fabricator General received the data. He saw the energy signature. He saw that the Omnissiah was walking. He did not see a monster. He saw the ultimate machine. He ordered the Skitari legions to board their ships. He wanted to claim the Emperor. He wanted to study the resurrection. He declared that Terra was now a dependency of Mars. The civil war was expanding. It was not just Guilliman versus Valerian. It was Mars versus Terra. It was everyone against the clock. Back in the room, the Emperor took another step. His foot hit the stone step. The stone cracked. He was heavy, denser than he should be. He was matter and warp energy fused together. He moved slowly, He was relearning how to walk. His movements were jerky, but he was closing the distance. Guilliman struggled against the pressure. He tried to stand. He shouted to his father. He tried to reach the human inside the monster. He recalled memories. He spoke of the Great Crusade. He spoke of Horus. He spoke of the dream of unity. The Emperor paused. He tilted his head. The name Horus seemed to trigger something. A memory of pain. A memory of betrayal. The Emperor looked confused. The psychic pressure lifted slightly. Guilliman stood up. He held out his hand. He tried to calm the beast. He said he was Roboute. He was the loyal son. The Emperor looked at him. The empty eyes narrowed. The lips moved. A word formed. It was a whisper that sounded like a rock slide. Thief. The Emperor did not see a son. He saw a thief holding his property. He saw a usurper wearing the eagle. The memory of betrayal was the only thing that remained. And now, every face looked like a traitor. The Emperor lunged. It was a terrifying speed for such a large creature. He jumped from the stairs. He landed in front of Guilliman. The impact shattered the floor. Guilliman raised the sword to defend himself. He did not want to strike, but he had no choice. The Emperor swung a fist the size of a boulder. It hit Guilliman's shoulder. The pauldron smashed. The Primarch was driven to his knees. The Emperor grabbed the blade of the burning sword. He grabbed it with his bare hand. The fire did not burn him. He squeezed. The metal creaked. He ripped the sword from Guilliman's grip. He held it up. The fire turned from orange to blinding white. The sword recognized its master. The Emperor swung the sword. He was not swinging at Guilliman. He was swinging at the air. He was cutting the fabric of reality. A rift opened in the throne room. He was trying to open a door. He was trying to go somewhere. Victorus looked at the coordinates on his screen. The Emperor was not trying to go to the warp. He was trying to go to the webway. He was trying to break into the ancient elder tunnels that lay beneath the palace. The tunnels that were filled with demons. The tunnels he had sealed shut 10,000 years ago. Valerian realized the horror. The Emperor remembered his great project. He remembered the Webway project. But he did not remember that it had failed. He did not remember that the tunnels were flooded with the armies of chaos. If he opened that gate again, terror would fall in an hour. Valerian shouted to the Custodes. He ordered them to attack. He ordered them to stop the Emperor. It was the hardest order ever given in the history of the Imperium. The 10,000 were ordered to fight the One. The Custodes charged. They surrounded the giant. Their spears stabbed at his legs. Their blades cut his skin. The Emperor did not seem to feel it. He swatted them away like flies. He cut them down with his sword. Golden armor flew in pieces. Blood sprayed on the melted gold floor. The Emperor was unstoppable. He was hacking at the air. The rift was widening. We could see the demons on the other side. They were waiting. They were smiling. They saw the Emperor opening the door for them. Guilliman charged back into the fight. He had no weapon. He used his fists. He punched the Emperor in the side. He tried to knock him off balance. He shouted for Victorus to do something. He shouted for the Magos to shut it down. Victorus was weeping. He was hiding. He knew there was no shutdown. The only way to stop this was to kill the body. And nothing could kill the body. The Emperor turned on Guilliman. He raised the sword to kill his son. The blade came down. Guilliman caught the wrist. He held it back. His muscles screamed. His armor servos whined and burned out. He was holding back an avalanche. He looked into his father's face. He saw the abyss. He saw the end of humanity. He saw that the golden throne was not a prison. It was a cage, and they had just let the beast out. The sword inched closer to Guilliman's neck. The heat singed his skin. The Emperor pushed. He was stronger, much stronger. Guilliman fell back. He was going to die. The story of the Imperium was going to end in a father killing his son on the floor of a ruined palace. Suddenly, a shot rang out. A beam of green energy hit the Emperor in the face. It burned the flesh. It blinded the empty eyes. The Emperor roared and stumbled back. Guilliman rolled away. He looked for the shooter. It was not a custodian. It was not a marine. It was a tall, skeletal figure standing in the shadows of the entrance. It was holding a staff of ancient metal. It was a Necron. It was Trazyn the Infinite. The alien collector had entered the chaos. He stepped forward. He spoke in a metallic voice. He said he had come to collect a very rare specimen. He said the Emperor was too dangerous to be left loose. He raised a tesseract labyrinth. It was a small cube that glowed with dimensional energy. He intended to trap the Emperor inside it. He intended to put the master of mankind in his museum. The absurdity of the situation halted the combat. Guilliman stared. Valerian stared. The Emperor rubbed his burning face. He looked at the Necron. He recognized the ancient enemy. The focus shifted. The civil war was paused. Now it was a brawl for the soul of the species against the galaxy's greatest thief. Trazyn smiled with his metal mouth. He said this would be the jewel of his collection. The green lightning from the staff of Trazyn the Infinite struck the Emperor's chest, but it did not stop him. The Emperor was not just a man anymore. He was a storm of psychic energy wrapped in meat and iron. He did not flinch. He reached out and grabbed the Necron Lord by the neck. The metal of Trazyn's neck sparked and bent. The ancient alien let out a screech of static. Trazyn was millions of years old. He had seen stars die. He had seen galaxies burn. But he had never felt a grip like this. It was the grip of absolute human rage. The Emperor lifted the Necron off the ground. Trazyn kicked his metal legs. He smashed his staff against the Emperor's arm. The phase blade cut deep into the regenerated muscle. Blood that looked like liquid gold sprayed onto the floor. The Emperor did not care. He squeezed harder. He wanted to crush the machine man. He wanted to break the toy. Roboute Guilliman saw his chance. He did not want to save the alien. He wanted to save the situation. He picked up his fallen bolter. He aimed at the Emperor's hand. He hesitated. It was a sin to shoot the Emperor. It was the ultimate crime. But Guilliman was a Primar. He was made to make the hard choices. He pulled the trigger. The explosive bolts hit the Emperor's wrist. They detonated against the bone. The hand spasmed. The grip loosened. Trazyn dropped to the floor. He scuttled backward like a spider. He was damaged. His vocal emitters were glitching. He looked at Guilliman. He nodded once. It was not a thank you. It was a recognition of a temporary alliance. The enemy of my enemy is my target for later. But for now, they had a common problem. The Emperor roared at Guilliman. He forgot about the Necron. He focused on the son who dared to shoot him. The rift in the air behind the Emperor tore open wider. The Emperor had been hacking at reality to get into the webway. Now the door was open, but he was not going in. Something was coming out. The smell hit them first. It smelled of sulfur and rotten blood. Then the sound came. It was the baying of hounds. Red shapes leapt from the tear in reality. They were flesh hounds of Khorne. They had sensed the violence in the throne room. They were hungry for the blood of demigods. The strategic situation had just collapsed. It was no longer a civil war. It was an invasion. The demons flooded the room. They were fast. They jumped on the Custodes. The golden giants fought back with spinning spears. They cut the beasts in half. But for every daemon that died, 2 more pushed through the gap. The throne room was becoming a slaughterhouse. Shield Captain Valerian rallied his men. He shouted orders to form a defensive ring around the base of the throne. He did not know who to defend. The Emperor was the threat, but the Emperor was also the prize. If the demons touched the Emperor, they would corrupt the last hope of humanity. The Custodes made a wall of gold. They fought back to back. Their guardian spears flashed with blue energy. They were killing machines, but they were tired. They had been fighting their own master. Now they were fighting the legions of hell. The Emperor stood in the middle of the chaos. He did not join the line. He stood alone. A large bloodletter demon charged him. The demon held a hellblade that glowed with black fire. It screamed a challenge. The Emperor turned. He did not use a weapon. He used his mind. He looked at the demon. The air around the creature compressed. There was a wet pop. The demon imploded. It was crushed into a ball of gore the size of a fist. The Emperor dropped the remains and looked for the next target. He was killing efficiently, but he was not distinguishing between friend and foe. When a custodian got in his way, he swatted him aside. The blow broke the custodian's neck. The Emperor was a neutral force of destruction. Magos Victorus watched from his hiding spot behind the main console. He was trembling. His logic circuits were overwhelmed. He looked at the energy readings on the Prometheus engine. The needle was buried in the red. The Emperor was drawing too much power. He was burning his own cells to fuel his psychic attacks. Victorus realized the biology would fail. The body would burn out in minutes at this rate. The resurrection would end in a pile of ash. Victorus looked at Trazyn. The Necron was hiding behind a pillar. Trazyn was checking his own gear. He pulled a device from a dimensional pocket. It was a black stone shaped like a pyramid. It absorbed the light around it. It pulsed with a negative energy. It was blackstone. It was the material the Necrons used to shut off the warp. It was the bane of psychics. Victorus understood the plan. Trazyn wanted to jam the signal. Guilliman was fighting 3 demons at once. He punched one in the face and crushed its skull. He kicked another away. He saw Trazyn holding the black stone. He shouted at the alien. He asked what it was. Trazyn shouted back. His voice was metallic and calm. He said it was a limiter. He said it could sever the connection to the warp. He said it would calm the beast. But it had to be implanted. It had to be placed directly into the chest cavity. It had to touch the heart. Guilliman looked at his father. The Emperor was glowing white-hot. Lightning was arcing from his eyes. He was preparing a massive blast. If he released it, the palace would crumble. Guilliman made a choice. It was a small choice in the grand scheme of things. He chose to trust the alien technology over the imperial dogma. He chose to modify his father rather than let him burn. He shouted to Valerian. He ordered the Custodes to clear a path. He told them to let the Necron through. Valerian hesitated. This was heresy. To let a Xenos touch the Emperor was death. But he looked at the demons. He looked at the dying guards. He saw no other way. He ordered his men to split the line. The Custodes pushed the demons back. They carved a bloody path to the Emperor. Trazyn stepped out. He held the blackstone shard. He looked at Guilliman. He said he needed a distraction. He said the subject would resist. Guilliman nodded. He took a deep breath. He charged his father. He did not charge to kill. He charged to grapple. He ran up the stairs. The Emperor saw him coming. The Emperor raised his hand to smite him. Guilliman screamed. It was a scream of defiance. He jumped. He tackled the Emperor around the waist. The 2 giants crashed to the floor. The impact shook the room. The Emperor was stronger. He started to peel Guilliman off him. He grabbed Guilliman's shoulder plate and ripped it off. He punched Guilliman in the ribs. The Primarch's armor cracked. Bone cracked. Guilliman gritted his teeth. He held on. He pinned the Emperor's arms for 1 second. That was all Trazyn needed. The Necron moved with unnatural speed. He slid across the floor. He jumped onto the Emperor's chest. He held the Blackstone Pyramid with both hands. He drove it down. He stabbed it into the open wound in the Emperor's chest. The black stone pierced the meat. It touched the heart. The reaction was instant. The white light died. The lightning stopped. The Emperor arched his back. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The black stone was doing its work. It was sucking the warp energy out of the body. It was grounding the psychic charge. The Emperor's eyes rolled back. He collapsed. He went limp. The demons in the room paused. The psychic beacon that had drawn them was gone. They were confused. The Custodes took advantage of the pause. They counterattacked. They slaughtered the confused demons. They pushed them back into the rift. Victorus ran to the console. He activated the field dampeners. He closed the rift. The door to the webway slammed shut. The silence returned to the throne room. It was a heavy silence. It was the silence of a tomb. Guilliman rolled off his father. He lay on his back, breathing hard. He was battered. He was bleeding. But he was alive. Trazyn stood up. He adjusted his cloak. He looked at the Emperor. The master of mankind lay still. The black stone was buried in his chest. Only the tip was visible. It pulsed with a dull green light. The Emperor's chest rose and fell. He was breathing, but it was a slow, mechanical rhythm. The wild energy was gone. The monster was gone, but the god was gone too. What remained was a body kept alive by a mix of dark technology and alien stone. Victorus slowly walked up the stairs. He approached the body. He pulled out his scanner. He ran a diagnostic. He looked at the results. He looked at Guilliman. He spoke softly. He said the subject was stable. The psychic output had been capped. The mind was contained. But the connection to the Astronomican had changed. The beacon was still on. But it was not being broadcast by the Emperor's will anymore. It was being filtered through the Blackstone. The frequency had shifted. It was cold. It was logical. It was no longer a song of hope. It was a mathematical grid. Victorus said the Emperor was in a state of permanent stasis. He was awake, but he was locked inside his own head. The Blackstone prevented him from projecting his thoughts. He was a prisoner in his own body. Trazyn clapped his metal hands. He said it was a masterpiece. He said he had saved the Imperium. He asked if he could take the body now. He said he had a perfect spot for it in his gallery on Solemnace. Guilliman stood up. He picked up the burning sword. The fire on the blade had died down to a low ember. He pointed the sword at Trazyn. He said no. He said the Emperor stays on Terra. Trazyn sighed. He said humans were so ungrateful. He said he would leave, but he warned them. He said the Blackstone would not last forever. It would degrade. In 10,000 years they would have this problem again. But for now, the cork was in the bottle. Trazyn tapped a button on his wrist. He vanished in a flash of green light. He teleported away. He knew when to leave a party. The immediate crisis was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The High Lords of Terra entered the room. They had been hiding in the bunkers. They saw the carnage. They saw the dead Custodes. They saw the black stone in the Emperor's chest. They looked at Guilliman for an explanation. Guilliman looked at them. He was covered in his father's blood. He looked like a king who had just killed his predecessor. He told them the truth. He said the Emperor was alive, but he was not the savior they expected. He was a weapon that had to be controlled. He declared martial law. He dissolved the High Council. He said he would rule in his father's name, but he knew it was a lie. He was ruling in his father's place. The father was just a battery now, a battery with a regulator made by Xenos. Victorus went back to his lab. He did not celebrate. He knew what he had done. He had tried to play God, and he had failed. He had not brought back the man. He had brought back the power, and now the power was leashed by the enemies of mankind. He looked at the Prometheus engine. He disconnected the cables. He smashed the control panel with a wrench. He destroyed his own work. He vowed never to speak of how this happened. He would write a report. He would say it was a miracle. He would say the Emperor tested them. He would lie, because the truth was too dangerous. The truth was that the Golden Throne was no longer a life support system. It was a prison cell, and the warden was a black stone from a dead world. The days turned into weeks. The Imperium adjusted to the new reality. The Astronomican was different. Navigators reported that the light was harder to see. It did not comfort them. It felt cold. It felt like looking into a neon light in a morgue. Ships traveled slower. They were more cautious. The zeal of the Great Crusade did not return. The religious fervor dampened. The people felt the change. They stopped dancing in the streets. They went back to work. The factories churned. The war machine ground on. But the spirit was different. The hope of a golden savior was replaced by the reality of a grim survival. Guilliman sat in the strategy room. He looked at the map of the galaxy. The Great Rift was still there. The Tyranids were still coming. The Orcs were still burning worlds. But the center held. Terra was safe. He looked at the reports from the throne room. The Custodes were guarding the Emperor with a new intensity. They were not just guarding him from assassins. They were guarding him from waking up. They had orders to alert Victorus if the Blackstone shifted. They were jailers. Guilliman felt a deep sadness. He had wished for his father to return. He had wanted guidance. He had wanted the weight taken off his shoulders. Instead, he had to beat his father into submission and lock him in a cage. He realized that the past was truly dead. There was no going back to the Golden Age. There was only the present, and the present was a war for survival. On the other side of the galaxy, a Necron overlord awoke in his tomb. He felt the shift in the warp. He felt the Blackstone network activate on Terra. He smiled. He knew what it meant. The humans had used the tool. They had accepted the gift. They thought they were saving themselves. In reality, they had just connected their god to the Necron network. The Overlord tapped a command into his console. He began to download data. He was downloading the Emperor's memories. The Blackstone was a two-way street. It suppressed the warp, but it transmitted data. The secrets of the Imperium were flowing into the databanks of the Necrons. Every battle plan, every hidden base, every weakness. The humans had plugged their mainframe into the enemy's internet. The strategic cost of the victory was infinite, but the humans did not know it yet. They were just happy the shaking had stopped. Back in the throne room, the Emperor sat motionless. His eyes were open. They stared at the darkness. Inside his mind, he was screaming. He was trapped. He could see the galaxy. He could see the threats, but he could not act. The Blackstone blocked his will. He was a passenger in his own skull. He saw the Necron code infiltrating his memories. He tried to fight it, but he had no hands to fight with. He was paralyzed. He watched as his empire continued to rot. He watched as his son tried to hold it together with duct tape and lies. The Emperor realized the irony. He had wanted to free humanity from the reliance on the warp. Now he was cut off from it. He had got what he wanted in the worst possible way. He was purely material now, and he was helpless. Victorus received a promotion. He was made Fabricator General of Earth. It was a bribe to keep him quiet. He accepted it. He moved into a high spire. He spent his nights looking at the stars. He wondered if he should have let the Emperor burn, if the explosion would have been better. A clean death is better than a life in chains. But then he remembered the faces of the people. They needed the lie. They needed to believe the Emperor was watching over them. They did not need to know that he was watching them through a camera lens controlled by a skeleton robot. Victorous drank his amasec. He toasted the night. He toasted the great lie. The Imperium was built on lies. One more would not break it. The final strategic shift occurred in the warp itself. The Chaos Gods had felt the surge. They had prepared for a great war. They had gathered their armies. But then, the light went cold. The anomaly vanished. The Emperor did not die. He just dimmed. The great game of the gods stalled. They were confused. Khorne roared in frustration. Tzeentch spun new schemes to understand the change. Nurgle stirred his cauldron, wondering why the corpse did not rot. Slaanesh whispered secrets that no one could hear. The resurrection had been a false start. It was a dud. The galaxy did not end. It just got greyer. It got quieter. The slow death of the universe resumed its normal speed. The sudden heart attack was over. The chronic disease returned. Guilliman visited the throne room one last time before leaving for the front lines. He stood before the throne. He did not kneel. He looked at the black stone. He touched the cold metal of the dais. He spoke to his father. He said he was sorry. He said he did what he had to do. The Emperor did not blink. The Emperor did not move. But deep inside the dead eyes, Guilliman saw a reflection. He saw himself, and he looked small. He looked like a child playing with fire. Guilliman turned and walked away. He had a war to fight. He had an empire to manage. He left the monster in the basement. He locked the door. He told the guards to let no one in, especially not the doctors. The experiment was over. The patient was stable. The patient was a prisoner. The timeline had shifted. In the original history, the Emperor was a rotting corpse that anchored the Imperium. In this new history, he was a preserved captive that anchored the Imperium. The difference was subtle but profound. The Imperium was no longer guided by a psychic beacon of hope. It was guided by a cold alien calculation. The decisions of the fleet became more ruthless. The mercy of the Imperium, which was already small, vanished entirely. Ships did not divert to save planets anymore. They followed the math. If a planet was not statistically worth saving, it was abandoned. The logic of the Necrons was bleeding into the logic of the Administratum. The Blackstone was not just dampening the Emperor. It was filtering the soul of humanity. We were becoming like them. We were becoming cold. We were becoming efficient. We were becoming metal. Victorious noticed the change in the reports. The casualty rates dropped. The victory rates rose. The efficiency of the Imperium increased by 10% in the first year. It was a golden age of logistics, but the art was dying. The poetry was dying. The passion was dying. The Imperium was winning the war, but it was losing its soul. Victorious realized that Dr. Frankenstein had not just created a monster. He had infected the village. The monster was in charge now, not the roaring beast on the throne, but the silent, cold logic of the stone in his chest. The machine had finally won. The flesh was weak, the stone was strong, and the Emperor was the ultimate proof. Even a god could be reduced to a component in a circuit board if you had the right screwdriver. The story of the resurrection was not a story of life returning. It was a story of life being replaced. The Emperor was the first of the new breed, a hybrid of man and pylon, a guardian who did not care, a watcher who did not weep. The chroniclers would write that this was the moment the Imperium was saved, but the poets would write that this was the moment the Imperium died, and they would both be right. The body survived, the spirit evaporated, the future was safe, the future was empty. The bells of terror rang again. But this time they were digital chimes, precise, perfect, soulless. The new era had begun. The Blackstone shard grew darker as it drank more of the Emperor's light. It was no longer a dull green stone. It had become a bottomless pit of void energy that hummed at a frequency that made the palace walls bleed. Magos Victor stood at the edge of the dais, with his hands trembling inside his copper sleeves. He had realized too late that the Necron device was not just a regulator. It was a beacon for something else. Deep beneath the crust of terror, the ancient pylons that had slept since the birth of the world began to vibrate in sympathy with the shard in the Emperor's chest. This was the final convergence. The Necron dynasties were not just watching. They were reclaiming. High Lord Hematalos returned to the chamber with a face the color of ash. He reported that the orbital sensors were picking up ghost signals across the solar system. Millions of tiny silver particles were materializing in the rings of Saturn. They were not ships. They were scarabs. They were the cleaners of the universe. They were coming to harvest the technology that Victorus had blindly activated. The strategic situation on the ground had turned from a civil war into a planetary infestation. Guilliman stood before the throne one last time. He saw the way the Emperor's skin was turning a strange metallic grey where it touched the Blackstone. The resurrection was being hijacked. The biology of the master of mankind was being rewritten into a living metal construct. Guilliman realized that the Necrons did not want to kill the Emperor. They wanted to turn him into their ultimate weapon. They wanted a Catan made of human psychic potential. Guilliman looked at Valerian and ordered the final protocol. It was the only option left that saved humanity from a fate worse than death. He ordered the destruction of the Prometheus engine and the manual collapse of the throne room. He wanted to bury the Emperor under the mountain. He wanted to kill the body before the machine finished its work. Valerian hesitated. To destroy the palace was to destroy the heart of the Imperium. But he looked at the Emperor's eyes. A single tear of liquid gold was rolling down the skeletal cheek. The Emperor was still in there. He was screaming for the end. He was begging for the silence he had earned 10,000 years ago. The Custodes moved. They did not attack the demons or the aliens. They attacked the floor. They set melter charges on the primary support pillars of the sanctum. The ground began to groan. The mountain of the Himalayas started to shift. Above them, the sky of terror turned black as the Necron fleet finally phased into reality. They were too late. The explosions ripped through the base of the Golden Throne. The Prometheus engine exploded in a fireball of white plasma that vaporized everything in the lab. Victorus vanished in a second of pure light. He died knowing he had failed his god, but perhaps saved his species. The ceiling of the sanctum collapsed in a rain of gold and stone. Millions of tons of rock fell onto the Emperor. The light of the Astronomican did not flicker this time. It went out with a sound like a closing door. The darkness was total. The Emperor was buried. The monster was gone. The god was gone. Guilliman stood in the ruins as the dust settled. He looked at the empty space where the throne had been. He was the last son of a dead dream. He walked out of the rubble and into the cold air of a world without a light. The Necron fleet stayed in orbit for a week. They scanned the ruins, but they found nothing. The Blackstone had been crushed into dust. The signal was dead. They left as silently as they came. The Imperium was broken. The communication was gone. The light was dead. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the man on the throne was at peace. He was no longer a battery. He was no longer a prisoner. He was just a ghost in the mountain. The war would continue in the dark. The humans would fight with swords and fire. They would die in the millions, but they would die as humans, not as components in an alien machine. Guilliman looked at the stars and saw only the dark. He raised his sword and ordered the march to begin. The age of miracles was over. The age of men had finally begun. It was a cold and bitter age. It was a time of winter, but it was theirs. They would own their own extinction. They would not be saved by a monster. They would be remembered by their scars. The history of the galaxy turned the page to a blank sheet. There was no more script. There was only the will to survive one more night, one more hour, one more breath. The silence was the greatest victory of all. It was the only thing the Emperor had ever truly wanted, and at the cost of everything Victorious had given it to him. The dust of the palace settled over the ruins of the world. The heart of the Empire stopped beating. The body was cold. The soul was free. The Emperor of mankind was finally truly dead. And in that death, he had given his people the only thing a father can give: a chance to grow up, a chance to fail on their own. The darkness was not the end. It was the beginning of the truth. We are alone, and we must be enough. The records of the final days were etched into the metal plates of a dying ship. In the deep dark of the void, the ships of the Imperium began to drift like autumn leaves. Without the light of the Astronomican, the navigators were blind. Some captains chose to stay where they were and build small empires among the local stars. Others dived into the warp and were never seen again. On the surface of Terra, the silence was heavy. The wind blew through the broken towers of the palace. The golden giants who once stood guard were gone. They had taken off their bright armor and walked into the shadows of the hive cities. They were no longer protectors of a god. They were veterans of a finished war. Roboute Guilliman did not return to Ultramar. He stayed on the broken earth. He spent his days sitting in a small room made of grey stone. He looked at the maps of a galaxy that was falling apart. He did not cry. He did not pray. He wrote. He wrote the true history of what happened under the mountain. He wrote about the man named Victorious who tried to fix what was meant to be broken. He wrote about the golden monster that almost ate the world. He wrote so that if anyone ever found the records, they would know the danger of trying to bring back the past. Deep beneath the rock of the Himalayas, the tomb remained sealed. No light ever reached the bottom of the pit. The machinery was rusted and cold. The gold was covered in thick grey dust. Somewhere in the middle of that ruin lay a skeleton. It did not move. It did not breathe. It was just bone and old metal. The spirits of the warp circled the mountain, but they could not find a way in. The connection was severed. The soul that had once burned like a sun was gone. Some say it shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Some say it simply vanished into the quiet. The people of the hive cities eventually stopped looking at the sky for a sign. They focused on finding clean water and growing food in the hydroponic bays. They lived short and hard lives. They forgot the names of the saints. They forgot the prayers to the throne. But they remembered how to help each other. They remembered how to stand together against the dark. The legend of the Emperor became a fairy tale, told to children to make them go to sleep. It was a story about a giant who fell asleep so that the world could wake up. The galaxy remained a place of war and terror, but it was no longer a stage for a single god. The play had ended. The actors had left. The stage was empty. And in the silence of that emptiness, the human race found a new way to be. They were no longer servants. They were the masters of their own short lives. The end was not a bang. It was a quiet breath in the dark. The experiment was over. The records were sealed. The galaxy turned, and the stars kept burning.